Welcome, everyone. I'm Aaron Kramer, President and CEO of BSR, and it is great to be with everyone today for the 18th episode in the conversation series that Morrison, Foerster, and BSR have partnered on over the last couple of years. ESG Influencers Leading Transformative Change. Pardon me. We're honored to have another very timely guest with us today, Ann Kelly, who is the Vice President of Government Relations at Ceres. And I can think of few people who are better positioned to talk about, pardon me, uh, talk about the implications of the U.S. election 2 weeks ago on sustainability. Ann is, as I say, at Ceres, where she leads the Ceres Policy Network, which advocates for meaningful climate and energy policy at both the state and federal levels across the U.S. Ann is a registered lobbyist and environmental lawyer with 25 years of public and private sector experience. In the 1990s, she directed the Massachusetts Environmental Strike Force. Sounds very Marvel-like, Ann. A team of legal and engineering professionals charged with bringing high-profile civil and criminal cases through the Massachusetts Office of the Attorney General. She has taught environmental law courses at Boston College Law School, Suffolk University, and most importantly, my alma mater, Tufts University. In addition to her degree, Ann holds a master's in public administration from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard and is a fellow in the American College of Environmental Leaders. And I can just say on a personal basis, having worked with Ann over many years now, she really is a very key player in the overall ecosystem at the intersection of sustainability in business, and particularly on climate, and particularly as it relates to public policy, not least in Washington. So great to have you with us, Ann. The discussion is going to be led today by Craig Martin. Craig is the co-chair of the ESG and Sustainability and also the Investigations and White Collar Defense Practices at MoFo. That's a very interesting portfolio, to say the least. Craig will be interviewing Ann for this episode. So with that, let me hand it to Ann and to Craig and to Ann. Take it away.
Thanks, Aaron. And thanks for joining us today. Aaron gave us a brief sketch of your career, but I wondered if you could just tell us a few things about how it was that you came to Ceres.
Yeah, happy to, Craig, and thanks for having me this morning. When I graduated from law school, environmental law was exploding. It was super interesting. There were not as many courses offered in law school as there are today. But I was offered a position in a private consulting firm that handled land use and engineering and architecture, and found that very interesting for a couple of years, but quickly became involved with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. And in that role, there was an emerging crime unit being established, the Environmental Crime Strike Force. Most of our state environmental laws and regulations had criminal penalties, but in those days, few of them were being enforced. And so many states were at the forefront: New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, to name a few, California. We're setting up individual units for criminal enforcement. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but because Aaron highlighted, I'll admit it was great fun. We had a drop a dime on environmental crime number. I called the number this morning, 1-800-VIOLATE, which you would ask for. Give us the who, what, where, and when of the environmental crime you observed, and we will protect you. We were recruiting informants, doing sting operations, setting up fake Superfund sites for people to come and dump. And in those days, you have to think back, there just was not the high levels of compliance that you see today. So we had, pagers and people burning at midnight and dumping into streams. And after some pretty high profile victories against Monsanto and General Electric and several others, I actually met Jan Schlickman, who was the lawyer portrayed by John Travolta in A Civil Action. And he was a hero for many of us young green lawyers coming out of school. And I said, Jan, we're so impressed with your personal injury work and your environmental work. Is there anything you would do differently? I saw him at a party. And he said, I would do everything differently. He said, litigation, it's a blunt tool, and you can solve problems more easily if you bring people around a table and resolve disputes that way. I was intrigued by Ceres, and for those of you who don't know, I also went and worked for the EPA, where I met Mindy Luber. But I was intrigued, Ceres was created in the wake of the Exxon Valdez spill in 1989, and it was all about helping investors be more actively engaged with the companies they own and to raise their level of performance in the environmental area. In 2009, I was intrigued by Ceres' model of working with companies. Again, criminal law, extremely blunt tool, stakes often were stacked against prosecutors at the state level. And also, I saw that many, many companies were actually coming on board and were putting in compliance programs, and we weren't getting those high-profile hits anymore. And it's not as interesting to go after, the small-time operators, just not as important. Education is much more effective. At Ceres, I was really intrigued with the mission, and in around 2009, a company we were working with, a major consumer brand, suggested that while individual corporate leadership was important, that it would be interesting to see what would happen if we brought together consumer brands in a collective way to work Capitol Hill. And this was at a time when Waxman-Markey, you might not be familiar with that bill, was a cap and trade bill that had failed. It was one that was largely supported and promoted by energy providers. We decided to set up a network of energy purchasers, energy users, businesses for innovative climate and energy policy, and that has grown now to over 80 companies. So we really represent their interests, their specific economic interests around climate action on Capitol Hill and in the States.
So, so much of the debate around climate action is posed as in opposition to the economic interest of business, and I wonder, is there an economic case for for climate action?
Yeah, I think that's the right question to ask, Craig. And I just have to tell you, being in this field as long as I have, we've continued to wrestle with economy and ecology from the get-go. And many times we've all referred to the Greek word oikos, which of course is the root of both words. There's no question about the economic case for climate action. When we're on Capitol Hill, Ceres puts itself in the background. We let the company stand up front and be crystal clear about the threats to whatever it is that they produce or whatever is in their supply chain, from cotton to coffee to cocoa to other commodities to any number of supply chain risks, to business disruption, to communities in their supply chain that have suffered. And now the data is in. When we started doing this work, there was less data. But we now know about the billions of dollars of loss associated with weather disasters. And we know about the benefits of resilience and of addressing a problem earlier versus later. We know that the cost of addressing climate change now will be much less than if we wait until later. And there are just so many examples that we now have to look at that demonstrate the economic risk associated with climate risk. So for us, climate risk is economic risk, and that underlies all of the work that Ceres does and most of the conversations that we have with lawmakers. And I'll say when the companies are making those claims, it's convincing. When you have major employers and major Fortune 500s who are looking carefully at business stability and long-term business operations, it's a pretty indisputable case.
So one of the places where this debate plays out is on the transition from fossil fuels, and there are obviously any number of interests who are arguing at least to slow that transition. Are these the types of arguments that you're marshaling when you're confronted with that debate?
Exactly. And again, the slowing the transition to the clean energy economy is also an argument we have heard for many years. Now, let me say that is an improvement upon an earlier argument, which was flat out denial. Back in 2009, 2010, we were still hearing from folks denying that climate change was real or that it was human caused. The good news is we don't hear that argument anymore. We're much more likely to hear from oppositional interests that this needs to be a slow and ordered transition. But if you read between the lines, what you're really seeing there is, and you have to sort of step back and look at this in historical terms, incumbent interests who are going to lose market share are going to object to transition, bottom line. It's no different than talking about buggy whip manufacturers who fought against the horseless carriage. That's exactly what we're seeing. And so there's no real logical, legal, or economic argument for slowing the transition to a clean energy economy that has the potential to make the US competitive, that has a potential for incredible technological innovation, and not to mention to solve and address this crucial problem of climate change. So I hear the arguments all the time, and I think it's pretty transparent that it just isn't valid. Now, of course, there's nuance, right? So in a particular place at a particular time, a particular place of a process of transition should be looked at carefully. Companies, and probably many companies on the line, are working on their own climate transition action plans. I don't mean to suggest that those are without some level of nuance. But there's no question about where the force of our energy needs to go toward the clean energy economy. And I don't see a valid argument for slowing that transition down.
So you mentioned the business for innovative climate and energy policy, and your corporate bench at Ceres. What you didn't mention was or you didn't note it goes by BICEP, which I think is one of the most clever acronyms I've run into. Anyway, that organization was very involved in the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act back in 2022. I wonder if you could just say a few words about what that act was intended to accomplish, and whether you think it's succeeding.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say that BICEP is a name of our policy network of companies. We can take no credit for that. That was a name that our friends at Nike came up with.
Is that right?
Yes, they did.
They know marketing.
The Just Do It people came up with that, and
Yeah.
we grabbed it immediately. And that is the network of companies that span a number of sectors: food, apparel, IT, consumer goods, healthcare, outdoor industry, and more recently, traditional manufacturing, like the largest cement company in the country, Holcim. So that multi-sector network is about 80, and then we have about 200 companies that we work with who are not paying members, but they join us on various campaigns. And yes, this group worked very hard to pass the Inflation Reduction Act back in 2022. We were actually advocates of the earlier version. You may recall President Biden was talking about Build Back Better, and we got behind that initially. It took various forms and had various price tags associated with it, but it ended up becoming the Inflation Reduction Act, which passed at the last minute as a reconciliation bill through a really interesting set of negotiations in the summer of 2022. By any measure, essentially what the law attempts to do is create investment in the clean energy economy. So it's best to think of it akin to the way in which the US invested in railroads. We invested in the interstate highway system. This is an investment in the clean energy economy. It's investing in an industry that needs a boost and will be better off with federal dollars. It was also designed to spur private investment, and that has actually happened. There's been over $300 billion of private investment to match the public investment that's taken place. It has been enormously successful between the IRA, and I should note the bipartisan infrastructure law, the innovation infrastructure law. There are 312,000 new jobs created. There are over 500 projects planned just under the IRA. Know that most of the clean energy projects that are planned or have broken ground take place in red states. And that's really important. That has summoned the support of Republican lawmakers, of Republican governors. Just to give you one concrete example, Q-Cells, some of your listeners may know of Q-Cells, is located in Dalton, Georgia, the carpet capital of the country. It's in Marjorie Taylor Greene's district. She has come out in support of the largest solar manufacturing facility in the country, employing 2,500 individuals now, and they're building another facility in Cartersville. I was able to visit that facility and was just really struck by the support of the community, of the local Chamber of Commerce, just a beautiful clean, climate-controlled factory floor that's doing good things and really helping the U.S. If we're going to be candid, really allowing the U.S. to compete with China, which is very much a bipartisan effort. So yes, I would say the IRA has been enormously successful, but it's a toddler. It's 2 years old. This is a 10-year program. So what we're going to see in the coming years, assuming that it stays in place, we are going to see increased investment, increased technology innovation, increased jobs, and increased competitiveness on the part of the U.S. in clean energy technologies.
And do you have any concerns about how it's been implemented to date?
You know, I think we all wish that it could have been implemented more rapidly. There's a tremendous amount of money to give away in the forms of grants and loans and tax credits, primarily tax credits. You know, I think many of us are frustrated with the pace, but I also, having worked for the federal government, understand that these things take time. And we're just hoping that the pace does not slow down in the coming years, and that the new Congress will completely embrace the Inflation Reduction Act and speed its implementation. I'm thrilled to say, if you didn't notice, back in August, there were 18 Republican House members who specifically wrote a letter to the Speaker defending the tax credits within the IRA and expressing their specific support. That was pretty monumental because they were not Republicans from just California or New York. They were from Georgia and Utah and Nebraska and Ohio, and really expressed sincere support for maintaining these tax credits in place. So we're pretty confident that those will not be clawed back and that we'll continue to see a return on this vital investment.
So you've alluded to some uncertainty in the future, and I'm expecting that part of that stems from the results of the election we had recently. What have the last 2 weeks been like for you?
Well, I won't sugarcoat it, Craig. I've been looking up these various stages of grief to try to figure out which one I'm in right now. I don't think I'm at acceptance yet. I may be at bargaining. In my official role, I have to keep hope alive, and we can, reflect on historical movements that have taken a very long time and that faced resistance. So the women's right to vote faced resistance. My parents were extremely active in the civil rights movement in Detroit, Michigan in the 60s. Talk about resistance. So there is often entrenched resistance to progress and to change. So stepping back, one can get a little bit of perspective, but anyone who has respect for the rule of law, as I do, and written and unwritten norms, one would have to have grave concerns about what could happen under this administration. From a business perspective, most of the businesses I hear from like certainty, predictability, are engaged in long-term planning. Even Darren Woods, the CEO of Exxon, said that, the flip-flopping of rules and regulations from administration to administration is unhelpful for business planning. And he, of course, said that in the context of encouraging the president to stay in the Paris Agreement. So I'm gravely concerned, but I am encouraged by the fact that last Friday, the Friday after the election, I joined a call with 350 sustainability professionals. And the call was thrown together in 24 hours. I didn't expect many to join on a Friday afternoon, but 350 joined, most on video. And I was just struck by the collective sense of keeping their commitment to climate action, keeping their commitments to their timetables, their targets, their science-based targets, their climate transition plans, and really looking for solidarity, looking for fellowship, for a united effort to make certain that we do not, in fact, pull back on the progress that has been made, in particular since 2020. So that gave me confidence, and it gave me hope that we are in this together, and there's been so much progress made. And I can use any number of time, points from 2016 or 2020. I guess I was reassured that this movement is just too big to fail. And by that, I mean the climate action movement. I mean the movement toward responsible businesses. Language has been an issue these last few years, so I'm choosing my words carefully. And I see that ESG is in your title proudly, Craig, and I very much appreciate that, because we're all about environmental, social, and governance issues and want to keep them alive and well. My gut sense is also that while there may be for reputational reasons, which I totally appreciate, there may be instances where companies are not able to be as candid, as open as they would like to be. They may not be able to write that op-ed or that blog that indicates their commitment, but that doesn't mean that they're not going to be doing work behind the scenes. In fact, much of our work with lawmakers is behind the scenes. Some of the most effective conversations we have, perfectly fine. I'm certain that the people on this line and those in our movement are going to be committed to their climate action goals. I have no doubt about that.
Well, you mentioned ESG and the language around that, and I do want to ask you whether you think that's changing or whether you're seeing that change. And it's funny that you point out the name of our group. We recently had a conversation with a client who is on several boards in red state companies, and she grimaced and when she saw that, and she said, "Geez, are you guys really still calling yourselves ESG?" Are you hearing that? What other words are would you use to describe this area?
Yeah, well, we are not marketing experts at Ceres, and I'm an environmental lawyer. So I turn to an expert like John Marshall. Many of you know of him. He is the CEO and founder of a firm called Potential Energy, and he's been a long time sustainability communications expert. He's done polling throughout the country on the word ESG, and you may know one of his findings he reported at Climate Week was in certain states, people thought that ESG meant eggs, sausage, and grits. So that's unhelpful. He was suggesting that people use basic language, and he calls for responsible business practices, that the more companies can just be very clear about what they are doing. We're committed to protecting our workers. That's what the S means. We're committed to proper governance. That actually that's more effective than an acronym that people don't understand. And unfortunately, that has been associated with words like woke, which are truly unhelpful and not descriptive. If it's any sign of a positive movement, I've learned that the word woke, compared to how many times it was, Googled in 2023, it went down drastically in 2024. Whether that has to do with the DeSantis campaign, I don't know. But I was encouraged by that. I think, again, those arguments, that kind of disinformation is unhelpful. Much better to look at what exactly you do with that in your title. What do the people on the phone do with that in their title? What does it actually mean? And again, if you really step back and you look at the origins of the anti-ESG movement, you have to go back to what I said earlier. If incumbent interests are feeling threatened, they're going to lash out. You're going to see backlash. There was a threat of capital moving from one place to another. That's really what we're looking at here. There was no substantive legal issue of any sort. And I can talk more about where that campaign stands now. But clearly, this was a result of a sense of competition.
So when you see the new administration on the horizon, what do you think the biggest threats and maybe the biggest opportunities are in the work that you're doing and that Ceres doing?
Yeah, I think the biggest threat is a lack of recognition about the urgency to address climate change in a serious way. Again, that notion that this is maybe human caused, maybe important, maybe, the word hoax has come up, but that it's truly not a priority. And that what is the priority is to make certain that the oil and gas sector has no limitations to its own growth, exploration, and development. That is my greatest concern. Coupled with that is the concern about the rollback of vital regulations and the regulatory state, and cases like Loper-Bright, which of course destroyed the longstanding Chevron deference rule, do not help in this regard. A really clear example. You may know that there's a pending rule out from OSHA at the moment, a heat rule that is basically designed to protect workers. And it's long overdue. We're commenting on it. The comments are due at the end of December, and it's designed for workers inside and outside and workers in the field. And it's really important that workers have proper shade and they have water. And word has come out that it's very likely that the Trump administration will just scrap the rule, will not move on the rule. Well, that's really not helpful for workers in any way, shape, or form. There are all kinds of clean vehicle regulations. There is a waiver granted to California within the Clean Air Act, which has enabled California over the years to have stricter vehicle regulations. I think that rule is at risk. And there has also been a tremendous emphasis on environmental justice from this particular administration. There's an initiative called Justice 40, which is designed to see that 40% of all the benefits from the IRA and the IIJA go to disadvantaged and overburdened communities. I worry that there won't be an adequate recognition of the nature of the plight of overburdened communities, historically disadvantaged communities. I worry that recognition will go away, that the kinds of community benefits plans that are required for DOE loans, for example, that those will be scrapped. Now, again, I'm giving you my worst fears, and I would love to be pleasantly surprised. I would really love to be proven wrong. And we are going to, in terms of the opportunity is to work with our Republican allies, including those 18 that I mentioned before, to work with governors in red states who are thrilled with the clean energy facilities that have invested in their states and with the jobs that have been created. I believe we can find common ground if we can find common language. And I have found that there are no better ways to transcend the politics than with a clean, clear, compelling economic case for action. And there are no better messengers than major employers who are in states, who have invested in states and in employees, and have understood the nature of climate risk in a very personal way, and who can convey that to lawmakers. Again, they don't need to hear from an NGO. They need to hear from major employers whose businesses are at risk, whose supply chains and commodities are at risk, who see a path forward and are willing to invest in that path and to pursue it and not to take us backwards. So my hope is in the coming together of those interests, and this is the work that we do every day, is to bring those interests not only to Capitol Hill and to the executive branch, but to states, to forward-thinking state governments. And that's exciting to see what states can do and are doing.
So you mentioned the Paris Agreement, and I wonder if that coalition is going to speak up if President-elect Trump pulls us out of the Paris Accords again.
Yes, well, thank you for raising that. And I think we all have the painful memory of 2016 when the threat was to leave the Paris Agreement. And that's when Ceres and the World Wildlife Fund co-created We Are Still In, which became a national movement and is now America is All In, and includes cities and states and healthcare institutions and higher ed and faith groups and others, thousands and thousands of signatories. My sense is that I'm so, of course, hopeful that the president-elect will not make that move. I don't know for certain. I know that he has said he would leave the Paris Agreement, but hope springs eternal, and I'm hoping some of his staff members, especially after COP29, will be able to influence him. But if he does leave, what you will see is a resurgence of America is All In. It'll come back bigger and better and stronger with more data and more evidence and more sectors involved, and they'll hit it with a bang. And you will see America is All In show up in Brazil at COP30, which is the COP next year. That'll be the first COP without the Biden administration. And we will show the rest of the world that America is all in. And that's precisely what we did in Bonn in 2017. I remember wearing buttons that said we are still in. And the US government had a little yellow sticky on a door that said US government. And that was it. There was nothing else. But foreign ministers were saying to us, oh, so the US is still in. And I think we're going to need to make that crystal clear. Part of being all in is being in support of the IRA and continued investment in the clean energy economy. So I want to remain hopeful, though, before that departure happens. I want to remain hopeful that it may not happen.
So I want to turn for a moment, if we could, to climate risk disclosures And I know that Ceres was for decades pushing very hard for just mandatory disclosures, and that I'm sure you're very happy when the SEC announced a program, a rule that required companies to issue those disclosures. Um, that has been in a bit of flux, both politically and in litigation. I wonder if you could give us a quick update on where that all stands.
Yeah, absolutely, Craig. And indeed, we celebrated when the rules were issued. Ceres has put a tremendous amount of effort into mandatory climate risk disclosure. Unfortunately, the rules were, and many of you, by the way, thanks to those on the phone who commented, there was a record number of comments submitted to the SEC. I think the SEC did a terrific job in taking those comments to heart. As you probably know, Scope 3 was not included in the final rules. We don't have to talk about that at the moment, but unfortunately, the rules have been challenged in court. And several people have filed amicus briefs. I think we're quite worried about the future of the rule and where that will go. The Loper-Bright case, again, just to refresh your memory, the essence of the case would suggest that unless Congress intended a particular set of rules and made that clear in the original legislation, that regulations that rely on that underlying statute are invalid, in a nutshell, and that there isn't the deference to the agency to know what to do best and how to interpret the original statute. In any event, we are worried. I don't know about what will happen with the lawsuit. We're certainly concerned that those may never take effect. We're thrilled with the initiative on the part of the state of California, having passed 2 climate risk disclosure bills last year, and we are excited about working with the California Air Resources Board when they come out with a draft rule in December. Once again, California is setting the stage for the rest of the country, and we are grateful. At the same time, it's important to recognize the global trend toward climate risk disclosure. I'm sure your listeners know all about CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive in the EU, which takes effect in 2025. There are disclosure standards in the UK, in New Zealand, in Australia, and Japan. I understand that Hong Kong and Singapore now have some standards as well. So you have to look at where is the trend going globally, and is the US going to be behind? From our perspective, investors need as much information as possible to make decisions. That's the entire thrust of our Freedom to Invest campaign. More information is better. More information about risk is better. That was true when it was, Y2K. It's true when it's various disasters. It's true if it's a food shortage or a pandemic, and it's true for climate risk. More disclosure, more transparency is better. Companies on the line already know this. I'm sure they're already disclosing through various voluntary mechanisms. I think it's only a matter of time when this becomes mandatory. Again, change is difficult. Change meets with resistance. This is going to happen. It's just a matter of when the US will catch up with the rest of the world. And again, who knows? I'm giving you my prediction about this rule, but making predictions is a fool's errand to some extent, given this particular administration. So I truly don't know, but just know that I think the momentum is on our side. I think obviously history is on our side. And most importantly, I think the global trend is on the side of more robust, transparent disclosure.
And it strikes me, Ian, that that American companies are not sitting on some island, and that to the extent that they've got a presence, a substantial presence outside the US, that things like the CSRD are, regimes that they need to take very seriously, and that, will have implications for what they say and do.
Exactly. And I think that they are taking those regimes very seriously. Oh, the other trend I should mention, Craig, that I've just learned about is there are actually some states that are beginning to look at mandatory climate transition action plans. So now this would be an expansion of disclosure of your climate risk. A mandatory transition action plan, and Ceres has put out a lot of guidance, as have others, on what an action plan needs to look like. If those became mandatory at the state level, that would also provide the momentum for a federal standard, because the last thing companies need or want is a patchwork of requirements across the country. And so I think that's a trend to keep your eye on as well.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. So Ceres obviously thinks that's important. As you said, you publish guidance about that. What does a CTAP plan show? What is that? What's included in a plan like that?
Well, a CTAP plan really walks investors through what a company is planning to do as it transition, on what timeline, based on what ideally science-based target or climate goal, over what period of time. And importantly for my work, investor, and by the way, we have ICAPs as well that we push for, so investor climate action plans. Both ICAPs and CTAPs call for policy advocacy, and that that's the part of those that I've worked on the most. We think it's really important that companies' goals and vision are supported by the right rules and regulations. And so we absolutely support companies stepping up for climate action at the state and at the federal level. But basically, it's being transparent about the risks and in some cases, opportunities that climate change poses for a given company within the context of a given sector. And again, we are starting to see some of these come out. Our colleagues at Levi's just put one out a few weeks ago, just to give a concrete example. I think we're going to see more of them. And I think as more climate transition action plans are drafted, the quality will probably improve as investors are able to comment. And then we'll see what the mandatory version ends up requiring. I think that's yet to come. But they're really important. And I know any number of companies are in the process of putting theirs together.
Well, so going back to the legislative realm, are there places where you see, new opportunities for bipartisanship to make progress in any of these areas?
There are actually, there are new areas for bipartisanship that shouldn't be ignored. I think one thing to understand is the consensus around the Democratic and Republican consensus around threats from China per se, and competitive threats from China. So one way that's manifesting is to consider a carbon border adjustment mechanism. And the basic philosophy there is that greenhouse gas emissions shouldn't be a competitive advantage. So the basic idea, if someone is making product X and they're doing so without proper environmental and labor standards, they're able to sell it cheaper. They shouldn't be able to sell that product in the US and have an unfair competitive advantage over US manufacturers. This is supported by Republicans and Democrats alike. Senator Cassidy of Louisiana filed a bill a couple of years ago. Senator Whitehouse of Rhode Island filed a bill. If we can reconcile these bills, and of course Europe has its own CBAM, if we could reconcile those bills, I think you would find a bipartisan consensus on essentially protecting American competitiveness, American manufacturing. Again, devil in the details, but I'm excited about what might come out of that. And if you think about it, that's kind of a precursor to a carbon price, which we've long debated. It's a form of a carbon price, but one that is much more palatable early on. I think there's also bipartisan consensus that we need permitting reform, and that's certainly true as we attempt to implement the IRA. We have to have renewable energy projects sited more quickly, get online more quickly. That requires permitting reform at the federal and the state level. We also need increased transmission rapidly. We have a tremendous new growth for our power grid as we attempt to electrify everything. So how do you quickly get projects online? Now, the trade-off is there are some who want to make certain that oil and gas projects can come online more quickly. So there's going to need to be a balance. You want the kinds of reforms that will specifically favor renewable energy, but there's probably going to have to be a balance. There's probably going to have to be a compromise. I look forward to some constructive conversations on that front. And finally, I should mention, of course, we're in the midst of a farm bill negotiation, and the farm bill is always a bipartisan effort. And I think it will be once again. I think the more controversial areas are the $20 billion in the IRA that is directed toward regenerative agriculture. And I think that may be a point of controversy, but we look forward to those negotiations as well. We are deep in the Farm Bill negotiations, and I think we will reach a bipartisan consensus there.
We've talked a little bit about the anti-ESG backlash, which is real. And in fact, Ceres has been targeted by anti-ESG activists. I wonder if you could talk about how Ceres has responded to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Ceres was targeted early on, and we were accused of engaging in antitrust activities, and nothing could be further from the truth. There is absolutely no evidence of any antitrust on our behalf, on our part. That's not anything we engage in. We do bring investors together for meetings and collaboration, but there is no antitrust of any kind. Essentially, there's been legislation in 40 states that was aimed to restrict responsible business practices related to ESG factors, and also to prohibit banks and institutions from considering ESG factors. And just for the record, in 2023, there were 165 state anti-ESG bills proposed, and 22 were adopted. In 2024, there were 161 proposed, and 60 of those were carried over from the year before, but only 6 were adopted. So that's really significant. And part of what has happened when those laws have been looked at by the state equivalent of the Congressional Budget Office, when the financial folks take a look at it, it's been, well, wait a second, how is limiting the factors that our investors get to consider going to help the citizens of a particular state? Well, it's not, obviously, and that's why most of those bills have failed. So Ceres is tracking the state laws very, very closely. We have many, many partners in this effort, banking associations, many organizations on the middle right who are completely appalled at the notion that anyone infringe upon one's freedom to invest. And that's really all we're looking for, is the freedom to invest and to consider all relevant factors, all material factors related to investment decisions. That's really all we are pushing for. And I think what you're going to see is more of these bills going down at the state level. We're going to continue to be active at the state level. We're also going to continue to monitor what takes place at the federal level. I think that's a question mark at this point, whether there will continue to be activity on that front and what form that will take. But we're certainly monitoring and paying attention to the larger movement.
Yeah, and I wanted to flag, you talked about freedom to invest, and that in fact is the name of a campaign that reflects a coalition of interested investors who are, as I understand it, seeking to protect their ability to take into account, consistent with their obligations, including fiduciary obligations, various factors, all the various factors that may inform their investment decision.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we couldn't have come up with freedom to invest. It's a fantastic phrase, and it just says so much. And polling has indicated that if you interview people across the country, do you want somebody messing with your pension plan, or do you want them to absolutely maximize return? And as you know, the argument has been that ESG factors are not pecuniary in nature, which is usually the statutory term, that somehow they don't have a financial impact and consequence. And of course, we know the answer there. What we may end up seeing, and I think we're also concerned, there is just a general resistance in some cases to shareholder action. And as I told you before, Ceres was founded on the notion that shareholders, investors, should be active in the companies that they own. Shareholders have every right to take a stand. We feel, again, they have a right to influence the companies that they own, and shareholder action can lead to a lot of good things. There is some pressure to get in the way of that, and we've seen that take various forms. But we're pretty confident that investor advocacy will win out, and that we will see companies and investors resisting any efforts to push back on the freedom to invest at the state and federal level. It's a pretty compelling campaign. You can go to our website, and there's lots of data and studies and quotes and testimonials that are useful if one is confronted.
Yes. You've talked a lot about your work in the federal realm. Where are you in the states? How many states are you working in? How do you decide what states you're going to be operating out of and get involved with?
Yeah, we are in 20 states right now, and the criteria that we use to be active in a state is whether we have our corporate allies based in a particular state. What does the bench look like? And that's a number one criteria. The other criteria is whether we have foundation funding in a particular state. We're largely philanthropically funded, and we need foundations to invest in our work. And usually that decision turns on the strength of the bench and also on the likelihood that we're going to have an impact. So particular states, many of them are purple states, where we can really have an impact on a particular law, on perhaps a 100% renewable energy standard, as we helped to pass in Michigan and Minnesota. That's really where we are invested. So we're active in a number of states. I could list them all, but across the country, including we actually have an office in California. We're active in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, Arizona, Colorado, Nevada, a variety of places where state leadership is truly important. And again, if you think about who our constituents are, most of these are companies that are seeking access to renewable energy. It is that simple. They are seeking to meet their climate goals. They're seeking to invest in renewable energy. And the more the state can make it available to them, the better it's going to be for their interests. They also support, the general movement away from fossil fuels and toward the clean energy economy. This takes many, many forms, including many, many efforts toward clean trucks and clean vehicles. And we simply provide a safe way for companies to weigh in with peers, with a multi-sector bench of peers that feel the same way. Sometimes that takes the form of just meeting with the governor, meeting with the state senate or the state house. Maybe it takes the form of companies showing up at a hearing, or publishing something in a local newspaper. There's tremendous work that is done at the state and local level. I don't want to dismiss it at all. And we learned that in 2016, during the first Trump administration, just how active and vibrant and important the states are. I mean, I could say a lot about California's leadership. I think most of you know that. But I would expect that we're going to see continued leadership on the state front. There's also, the states are benefiting from much of the funds that they're getting from the IRA. One of these funding pools comes in the form of the Homes in Here program, which is basically a consumer rebate program for heat pumps and other energy efficiency appliances. And so you can, in the states that accept that money, you can go to Home Depot and get a major discount when you buy a heat pump or an induction stove. And these are really important. So I think those efforts are going to continue. We're certainly going to continue to be active in those states. We're also active in the states where there is an anti-ESG campaign that we can push against.
So in the days coming, leading up to the election and perhaps post-election, you can detect some hesitation, perhaps among companies that are concerned about, if they express views on the issues that you've been discussing here today, that are of interest to them, interest to their stakeholders, that they're going to suffer retaliation. And I wonder about the challenges for a group like Ceres that are bringing people together, and helping people and interests have a voice. First of all, is that a real thing, or that hesitation? Are you detecting that? And if so, how does an organization like Ceres deal with that?
Yeah, it's a good question, Craig. And yes, I am detecting some hesitation. We have seen some amount of what's been called green hushing, and sometimes there's just earnest fear for companies who have a presence, particularly in red states, and they want to have a good relationship with the governor. They also want to have a good relationship with the federal government and the new administration. And they're worried about being misinterpreted. This gets to disinformation. This gets to people not understanding environmental, social, and governance, or to not understanding the true nature of climate risk. What we recommend is to carefully consider how companies are communicating what it is they're doing. And to that end, I'm happy to invite your members to a webinar we're doing on December 5th, and I'll send this information through to you all and to Aaron. It's with John Marshall. And again, you can look up John Marshall, and he's done tremendous polling in across the country about what are the words that a company should use to simply describe its vision and its goals around climate action. What are the words that are going to be acceptable, that are not going to be inflammatory or volatile, but that are simply going to properly represent the vision and goals and leadership of a given company in a given sector? I don't want to quote him. He's really a master of language and has been at it for a very long time. I think it's useful to take some of this guidance. The second thing we recommend is that companies act in groups, that they join the biggest tent possible. And we've got one which I'll also make available on December 4th and 5th. We will be in DC, working Capitol Hill, behind the scenes. We have many companies signed up just to tell lawmakers what is most important to their companies, why they are invested in climate action. I think finding big, safe tents for advocacy is the most important thing that companies can do. And it may be within their own sector, that's fine. It may be in a multi-sector network like ours. It may be through a trade association. But I think that would really recommend companies find allies through which they can express themselves and continue to have the kind of credibility that they have previously enjoyed with investors, employees, customers who expect climate leadership. They don't want to be shying away from their climate leadership. They just want to find a way to express it that isn't off-putting.
One of the fascinating things about what you do, Anne, is you're obviously a lawyer. You're obviously very involved in policy. It's just interesting to me that when you talk about these issues, you're weaving not just the law and the political reality, but also things like polling, or how do we express ourselves clearly? How do we leave ourselves less vulnerable either to being misinterpreted, either, intentionally or otherwise? I would really love to hear how it was that you came to develop that approach to your work. And was that something that, because I don't think law school really prepares anybody to do that. And we do have a number of lawyers on, and I'm just curious to hear how you personally got to this point where you're weaving these things together in a way that to me feels very seamless.
Well, I appreciate that, Craig. You're right, it wasn't always this way. I mean, I'm old enough to remember John McCain and Nancy Pelosi sitting on a couch together saying, we've got to act on climate change. It's super important. I remember in my early years of work with Senator Lindsey Graham, I introduced him as a climate champion at one of our first lobby days around 2011. And we thought, terrific, we're going to work with both sides of the aisle. We're going to solve this problem. In 2012, we championed a declaration that said tackling climate change is the greatest economic opportunity of the 21st century. Simply the right thing to do. We got thousands of companies signing it so that when Barack Obama stood at Georgetown on that famous day when the heat was so strong that it melted the teleprompters, he had paper. And I laminated our declaration with all the logos on it. And he said, this is my climate action plan. Here's what we need to do to address climate change, but don't take my word for it. And he held up our declaration, which was laminated. And he said, look, you've got General Motors, you've got General Mills, you've got all these companies Nike getting behind this, saying that climate change is real. Let's just do it. And there was a consensus then that I don't think it had been as politicized as it is now. Now, yes, of course it was politicized. But from there, as you started to see deep denial and opposition on the part of the Republican Party that only got worse and then took on the odd forms of the last few years, we all had to keep up So we were forced to look at polling. We were forced to look at our language. We were forced to look at whether or not we were doing more harm than good. I mean, I won't mention any particular administration, but I'll just say that after 2016, I thought we were faced with profound challenges of making our case and making it in a compelling way. We lost some of our greatest Republican allies. They either retired from the House or Senate. There's many I could name who were absolutely with us. There was a bipartisan climate solutions caucus in the House. Representative Carlos Curbelo, co-founder in Florida, lost his seat. We still work with him as a consultant. Bob Inglis, my friend from South Carolina, lost his job because he said, I don't hate Barack Obama and I think climate change is real. Gone, out of office. So let's not. So we were kind of forced, I think. I think we were just forced to say, how do we create a safe path for advocacy for companies and investors that are trying to do the right thing? What do we need to give them? If we're their legislative concierge, what do we need to give them for talking points so their businesses can survive and thrive and their leadership is respected? And that's really forced us into looking at a lot of polling data, being very careful when we go places about the words we use. But the data doesn't lie. The clean energy data doesn't lie. And the investment in the clean energy economy is clear and compelling. And we'd like to go back to those numbers. There's a certain number of jobs, no matter how you slice it. China is a major competitor, no matter how you look at it. We have a phenomenal opportunity to be competitive in the clean energy economy, and the clean energy revolution. And those numbers and those phrases won't change.
Well, Anne, I've really enjoyed speaking with you today, and I can't thank you enough for taking the time to join us. With that, I'm gonna pass this back over to Aaron.
Thank you, Craig.
Well, and thank you both, Anne and Craig, for what was a really rich discussion. Great insights, actionable, and we will see things unfold. Two things. One is BSR will be publishing a piece tomorrow on our website, bsr.org, that takes a look at the landscape for sustainability in light of the election. One teaser, I would say, is we've tried to compare how 2025 and 2017 are different. I'm delighted to hear from Anne that we are still in. Will be one of those things that is not different, unless perhaps it's got even more impact this time around, and it had a lot last time. So look for that, and look for news of our next webinar, which will be before mid-December, and it's going to be a sort of an open-ended look back at 2024, and which has been a consequential year in some ways that have been good, in some ways that have been less good, but it should be an interesting discussion nonetheless. So Craig, Anne, thank you very much, and thanks to everyone who joined us. Bye for now.